Dorothy, we're sitting here beside Lake Burley Griffin today because we've included your short story, The Boatman of Lake Burley Griffin in the Invisible Thread.
Yes.
And it's based on an experience that you had when your son was lying in the Canberra hospital, which was just around here, close to death. So can you tell us about how that experience actually led to this story?
Well, yes, my son was only 11 months old and he got salmonella poisoning. And yeah, as you said, well, for days he was hovering between life and death. And I used to go and sit down. I couldn't go home, really, and I couldn't stay here. So I was in this terrible state of suspension, as one would be. And up until then, Canberra had just been this place I'd come to because my partner got a job here. But what happened to me was everything became very real because I was in such a panic. And I wrote the story, which is about somebody between life and death. It's not only the girl who's sick in the hospital, but her parent, her father. And the boatman of Lake Burley Griffin is a mythical figure who visits this distressed parent while their child is dying in the hospital. And it taught me something about places of the heart. Like it became, in a funny sort of way, it became the place of my heart after I'd been through this experience of suffering. If my child had died, I don't know what would have happened. I might have decided I could never live here. But because he survived, that was really the beginning of the connection between my imagination and this place. Does that make sense?
Yeah, in fact, that's really interesting because you've said before that story was really marked the beginning of your bond with Canberra.
And that's because he was so close to death here and he survived.
You've written about Canberra a lot. You were here for 30 years and a lot of writers avoid Canberra as a place, but you've really embraced that, haven't you?
Well, as part of that, the contradiction between people from outside hating the place and putting it down for all sorts of reasons, for the very reasons I've tried to indicate in my little story of what happened to my son. They think that passion and grief for some reason can't take place here because people must leave what matters to the most or their innermost beings at the borders. It's often presented in that way. And I mean, there's a ridiculous story of going back a few years now, but when Cheryl Kono was having an affair with Gareth Evans and she explained the reason why she'd fallen into bed with him against, her morality, she blamed it on Canberra's artifice, that somehow or other ethics and everything flew out the window, which is an absurd thing to say, of course. And in the Parliament House is some sort of ethical centre, except that that's terribly complex and it's often a thing people don't want to accept. So that in all these funny ways, I just got interested. I got interested in what does it mean to leave your heart at the border? What does ethics mean? And what does it mean to give birth to a living place as opposed to the site of government? And you see, I was lucky enough to live, I think really Canberra did give birth to itself as a living place during my time here, because I think it was sort of just on the brink in the 70s. But then you need a certain critical mass, a certain number of people who called the place home. And I was lucky enough for those things to happen while I was actually living and writing here. That's my belief. Other people might think that's a load of nonsense, but that was my experience.
And so having set major works here in Canberra, what has been the response to those works from people outside of Canberra?
Well, often from Australians are put down, but then 2 of my books set here have been published in the United States. And that was a really interesting experience for me because, of course, they didn't know about the anti-Canberra bias. It meant nothing to them. So in a way, I got more, I didn't have to get over that hurdle dealing with American editors and so on and an American publishing company, which was really an interesting thing because almost everybody, there's an initial hurdle. Oh, why Canberra?
So you experienced that with your publisher, for example, did you? In Australia?
In the early days we did, and you would have interviewed other 7 writers, but we had this funny thing about our anthology called Canberra Tales. We wanted to call it Canberra Tales, and somebody may have told you the story already about how Penguin refused to call it Canberra Tales, wouldn't have a bar of it, because to put Canberra in the title of a book was to give it the kiss of death. That was literally what they said to us. Maybe not the kiss of death phrase, but what they meant. And when they brought out a second edition, they very sneakily changed the title. So that was very much alive at that time, that knee-jerk bias.
Just going on from that with the 7 writers, because you were part of that group in the 80s and 90s, and it struck me that all of you actually wrote major work about Canberra. You know, there's Marion Halligan's The Point, there's Sarah Dowse's West Block, you know, there's your series set here in Canberra. Why do you think all of you felt comfortable doing that when so many others don't?
Initially it was up you know, we want to do it, we'll do it. But each of us in our different ways, I think, that's almost a sort of superficial or cynical response. It's got nothing to do with one's integrity as a writer, but each of us in our different ways, we made our own bonds, and that's what you write out of. You write what you have to write, what your emotions tell you need to write. And it was obviously different for all of us, but all of us went through that same, this is in my bones, this is what I have to say.
I was talking to Marion Halligan recently about her experience of being in the 7 writers. What was it like for you? What was the value of that group for you? Because it's this group that people sort of hold up as a legendary kind of group, that everyone would aspire to be a part of something like that. What did that mean to you?
Well, for a start, I think that's a false view of it. I mean, it took us ages to get off the ground as a writers group, and we weren't at all well known, and initially it wasn't really clear what kind of a group we were going to be. Marion may have said this, I may be repeating myself, but for ages it didn't seem as if we'd survive at all. So that business of that sort of iconic status is not something that we have ever fostered or sought. But because it lasted, its longevity is one feature. To have something like that go on for 20 years, that you knew that you would get honest responses about a piece of writing, that you could take anything to them, it wouldn't, and you could take ideas to them, or you could take some scrappy first draft, and people would actually pay attention. That's immeasurably hard to find.
Yeah, it is, and I think that's why it appeals to people. It is hard to find its longevity, and also the fact that you've all been so successful.
Yeah, well then again, there was no way of predicting that from the start. We had this celebration, because some are a lot older than me, like there's a decade between Marion Eldridge, who obviously died in the 1990s, was 12 years older than me. So people, I had little children, they had older children. We had a celebration when the number of our published books finally became greater than the combined total of our children and grandchildren. Because for ages and ages, we had more kids and grandkids than our books, and we didn't think that would ever change. So that was some sort of indication of how we saw ourselves. There was a certain, we didn't take ourselves that seriously. It was that we did and we didn't. You know, we never took success for granted.
For a small population, Canberra has, a huge number of acclaimed writers who've actually lived here over the years. Why do you think that is? Do you think that's something to do with the nature of Canberra itself?
Well, I think that the ACT government is very supportive. That's an obvious point to make, and not only for literature but for all the arts. But my partner got a job in the press gallery in the late 1970s. I didn't want to come to Canberra for all the wrong reasons. So I went to Sydney from Melbourne. We'd been together in Melbourne. I went to Sydney, which was, to me, seemed to be some sort of geographical compromise, but it was absolutely a stupid thing because I actually spent 10 months on the highway hitchhiking. And this was the time of Ivan Milat. And because I was too poor even to afford the train fare. And when I actually made the decision, okay, I'll come here and I'll live with him, was such a relief. And part of the relief was that I no longer had to worry about a writerly style or going to the right bars. I was young still, you see, and in Melbourne you sort of, what length your jeans were, that actually mattered. Well, Helen Garner wrote about that, and she wrote about tracksuits and how awful they were. And in Sydney you had to worry about all that sort of stuff. But here it didn't matter. It was too small. It was too small for people to be divided in those who wore tracksuits and those who didn't, or those whose jeans were too short. And that may sound really foolish, but it was such a relief. And then when you had young kids, it was so much easier. You could be a mother and a writer, and you didn't have to, somehow or other, all that stuff was just accepted.
So in a sense it was liberating
It was
as a writer?
incredibly liberating. And I didn't anticipate that. I thought there might be the same levels of hierarchy and the same need to appear in the right bars, except it would all be microcosmic compared to Sydney or Melbourne, but it just didn't exist. Perhaps it exists now. I would bet that it probably does. But back then, at the end of the 70s and the 80s, no one had got around to classifying people according to all that sort of stupid stuff, whether you were hip or cool or...
It's interesting that you say it's liberating, because that's actually the opposite perception of what people have about Canberra. Like you were saying, that in fact Canberra can't possibly give rise to works of imagination because of its very nature. But what you're saying is actually quite the opposite.
Oh yes, it was immensely liberating for me. It was a great relief to have made the decision and stopped running up and down the highway. And then I very quickly got in touch with Sarah and Margaret Barbalet and a few others who never ended up being part of the long-term group. But I thought, wow, you know, I can do all this stuff. It doesn't matter what I look like. It doesn't matter that I've got a baby or I'm about to have a baby. They just accept all that.
So now you live back in Victoria again after 30 years here. Looking back on your time here, how do you think that actually affected you as a writer?
Well, my writing life is here, all of it. You know, I hadn't published anything except the odd short story when I came here. So I just think it was an immense privilege and stroke of luck for me, because I didn't seek for it to happen, but I lived through what to me was a great creative, a renaissance. Well, don't know if it's a renaissance. What was the renaissance? You have to ask for that. But it was an immense flowering and blossoming of creativity. And that was great luck, immense luck.